Hello and welcome to a new Squirrel Views video. In this video I will be doing my first ever countdown. Countdown of my top 10 best horror movies. Now these are just my favourites at this time. Ask me again in a couple of months and it'll probably change. And if it was when I was way back, when I was like 15 back in 1990, it would be very different again. And so there's going to be the fact that there's going to be many films that a lot of you actually like and are bewildered by their absence on the list, or the fact that some films that are on the list you think should be higher. But in the words of Mike from Demented Pictures, no list is definitive, only the one you make yourself. If you do like horror, I do highly recommend the Demented Pictures YouTube channel, and I'll leave a link in the description below. So now let's get on with this list. At number 10 is Sinister. Now I came to this quite late. It'd been out for some time before I actually saw this film. I kind of got disheartened by a lot of the horror films that were coming out for a long period and kind of gone off it, which is why it took me some time to go to this. It's one of those that is fantastic psychological horror. The fact that it's actually the main character is a writer, being a writer myself, that very much appealed to me. And there's some really incredibly creepy scenes and it's very well written. Of course, unfortunately, like many films that of horror, especially in the horror genre, that was actually any good, it got sequels of diminishing returns. As with many horror franchises, stick with the original, don't bother with the sequels. In at number 9 is my first Hammer horror, Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Now this may come as a surprise to some people who are actually also Hammer fans. I haven't gone for the horror of Dracula, the first Dracula that Hammer did. But my personal favourite, and my favourite horror film for quite a long time when I was actually much younger, was Dracula, Prince of Darkness. It's an odd thing when it comes to depictions of Dracula and Frankenstein, particularly for the Universal pictures and the Hammer horrors. When it came to the Universal ones, I enjoyed Dracula, the Bela Lugosi one and the Spanish version, which many horror fans actually feel that is actually even a more superior film to the Bela Lugosi version. But I wasn't really that much of a fan. I mean, I actually prefer the 1922 silent Nosferatu over the Universal Dracula. But I did enjoy the Frankenstein with Boris Karloff. But when it was odd that it was the opposite for me when it came to the Hammer horrors. For me, for the Hammer horrors, I loved the Draculas. Wasn't really a big fan of the Frankensteins, even though in some of the Frankenstein sequels you've got actually prime Peter Cushing, just really acting at the top of his powers at that time. But yeah, so I mean, I've always loved Hammer horror, even as a kid when I was they were the first of my introduction to horror, and used to actually have horror comics and stuff. And that's, you know, when I was old, when I was sort of in my early teens and first is thinking that I wanted to be a writer, and it leading to my parents going to a parents' evening and my English tutor saying to him, he's very good at, he's got a very good imagination, very good at storytelling, but do all his stories have to be so gory? And at that time, yes, they did. At that age, I was only interested in writing gore horror. But I wasn't only interested in watching gore horror. I mean, it was a little time after the here in the UK where they had the video nasty stuff that actually happened. And I admit that as a teenager, I was one of very many teenagers who saw the list of the banned video nasties as a challenge more than a warning to actually go out and see them all. And so I enjoyed those at that time, but I still, during that period, still loved Hammer, which is why Dracula Prince of Darkness is still there in the list. At number 8 we have Candyman. Now technically you could say this is two films, because we are talking about the 1992 Clive Barker penned Candyman, or at least based on the story by Clive Barker, and brilliantly acted by Tony Todd, which was something of a departure in horror at the time. I mean, it was after all the biggest craze during the 80s of Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger. So it was an attempt to actually create a new kind of iconic horror icon like those two. But Candyman was something different. I mean, he became a horror icon, and it led to some unfortunately pretty poor sequels. So, like many films of, you know, horror franchises, as I said for Sinister, stick with the original, don't bother with any of the sequels. But only last year we had a new Candyman film in 2021, and it's actually really good and actually pays respect to the original in a really clever way. But in the original, the main character was studying urban legends, and her story from the first film in the 2021 film has become an urban legend of its own. So I mean, the way they've actually developed the Candyman story, the Candyman character, and paid homage to the original is really good. So I mean, I'd say both of them, both the original and the new 2021 film, belong on this. Just can share this number 8 spot. At number 7 is John Carpenter's Halloween. Now, many may think this should be higher on the list. This to me was, again, I mean, this started the craze for the actual, you know, killer flicks like the Freddy Kruegers and the Jason Voorhees. This is where it started, and not only is this where it started, is John Carpenter done it so much better than everybody else. Now, don't get me wrong, Wes Craven's a great director, and the first Nightmare on Elm Street is a decent horror film, and it deserves its place as one of the 80s classics. And as I said, when I was actually into my gore horror and everything as a teenager, I preferred Jason Voorhees and watched the Friday the 13th films more than I actually enjoyed the Nightmare on Elm Street. I did like the concept than it being actually a killer in your nightmares and everything. Um, and the first film was great. The second one was atrocious. One of the worst horror movies I've ever seen. And yeah, I enjoyed the third one, but you know, none of them, to me, actually got to the heights of Halloween and Michael Myers. John Carpenter. I mean, I've always been a fan of John Carpenter's direct films ever since seeing Halloween for the first time. Um, so I mean, it is a seminal piece of work, and a lot of the 80s classics of horror wouldn't have happened without this film. So that's why I think it deserves a place on my list. And number 6 is another Hammer, The Devil Rides Out. Now, this was, I mean, as growing up as a kid, when I was a kid, surrounded by books, I was always an avid reader. My mum had a lot of Agatha Christie books, which after reading, a couple, I just really began to hate Agatha Christie with a passion. Basically because after actually, even as a kid of like 7, 8 years old, identifying the pattern of what she used to choose which of the potential suspects was going to be revealed as the killer at the end, and it's usually the most ridiculous and in some cases almost impossible to be that person. I've really started to find it irritating. But at the same time, from my dad, I actually read a lot of the Dennis Wheatley books, and I became particularly interested in the Duke de Richelieu novels, which The Devil Writes Out is one of them. And it's a real shame because, I mean, you've got Christopher Lee playing the character of Duke de Richelieu perfectly. It was the first film, when I first saw it, I must have been quite young, maybe 10 or even younger when I first saw it, and it was the first film that actually scared me. I mean, it was so good. And obviously I loved actually the fact that it scared me, so it made me love the film even more. But it also shows how good a series of Duke de Richelieu films, or even a TV series based on the Dennis Wheatley's Duke de Richelieu novels, could be. And it's just a shame that nobody's ever done any others. I mean, they did do another Dennis Wheatley, which was To the Devil a Daughter, later on in the 70s. But that film is crap and just best avoided. But The Devil Rides Out is just, at a time when Hammer had moved away from Bray Studios, their original home, and actually were on the decline. You get awful things like the Dracula AD 1973 or whatever year it was, which is supposed to be Dracula in the city in the swinging 60s, except it's actually based a few years after all the swinging, and it's just pretty awful. And because the quality in Hammer films was on the decline at that time, but they still managed to produce this masterpiece. And as I say, it's just a shame nobody has actually even come up, decided to actually do a whole series of Duke de Richelieu films, or even a TV series. It would work great. Halfway through my list, and again another one some probably feel that should be higher, which is Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. Also, I mean, there's a lot of people go for the sequel because of how badly the censors cut the hell out of the original Evil Dead, and so Evil Dead, the beginning of it, Evil Dead 2, the beginning of Evil Dead 2 is pretty much a remake of the original, of the first film. But there wouldn't be an Evil Dead 2, there wouldn't be a franchise with Ash or anything without this first one. And the effects, the camera work, it's fantastic. Considering the low budget this was in, this really, I mean, this and Halloween, you've got, two iconic films to actually show what could be done with such a small budget. And Evil Dead is, I still think is one of the best, and again, one of the classic horrors of the 80s. Okay, then we've got The Shining. The director Stanley Kubrick, you give him any subject, he seems, 2001 Space Odyssey is still one of my favourite sci-fi films. Him and Arthur C. Clarke got together, and Stanley said to Arthur, I want us to actually work together on making the best sci-fi film ever. And when it came to The Shining, some of the elements that he actually included, the design of the hotel, where everything, there was doors that led to nowhere. You could look down at, you'd see a corridor and there's a door that cannot exist. Can't be a room there because of the dimensions of the hotel, or a corridor that will go nowhere. All these were deliberate, and they were perfectly designed by Stanley. And so much of that, all these elements are designed to make the viewer just feel uncomfortable and unsettled all the way through, which adds to that horror. Of course, Stephen King didn't like it. Famously didn't like it because it wasn't that accurate to his book. Well, sorry Steve, but it's better than your book. It's the same with George Lucas. The film he produced was a mess, and it was only his wife and another editor who managed to actually fix it and put it together into the classic that we now know as Star Wars. And then he didn't actually make Empire Strikes Back, and it was such a far superior film to Star Wars, and it proved that even though he created it, he wasn't the best person to be making these Star Wars films. And so he, publicly said he didn't like Empire Strikes Back. It sounds to me that there's just a bit of envy and jealousy. Right, and then we're on to number 3, and my first foray into, or my first discovery of J-horror with Ring, or Ringu, as it's sometimes known. This was my introduction. It was sometime in the 90s where Channel 4 used to have particular nights, like a band series, a week full of band films and stuff, and the one time they were doing horror movies and foreign horror movies, and that was the first time I actually saw Ring, the original Ring, on Channel 4 many years ago. And that was my introduction to J-horror, and I've loved J-horror ever since. Which has also actually led me to actually hate with a passion any American remakes, which is not entirely fair, because The Ring, the first actually American remake of Ring, isn't too bad. it is actually a decent film. All the other actually attempts at American remakes of J-horror have been horrible, been crap, and they should just leave it alone. But they don't, and they probably never will. And now at number 2, again on many people's lists, this would be the film at number 1, and that's understandable. Exorcist, again one of the seminal horror movies from the 1970s, the first horror movie to actually win an Oscar, and you know, it deserved it. Even the book by William Peter Blatty is well worth read, and bizarrely the second book, the sequel, not the film but the actual book sequel, Exorcist II: The Heretic, by William Peter Blatty, was also really good. It's a shame that the actual film, the actual second Exorcist film, wasn't very good. It's one of those odd ones where, same with, as I said, with Nightmare on Elm Street, the first film's good and the third film's good, but the second one's not. But yes, I mean, what can you say about The Exorcist that hasn't already been said? You know, one of the greatest horror movies of all time. Not only that, but one of the greatest movies of all time. Just the acting is spot on. The subtle hints. I mean, the fact that you see Karras on a subway platform, and this tramp says to him, you know, begging for money, and actually saying, you know, will you help an old altar boy, Father? I'm a Catholic. And then it's quite a long time after that into the film when he first meets Reagan, and the possessed Reagan, and just that repeated line, the fact that the demonic voice from Reagan repeats that same line, just, you know, it gets me every time, you know, just the feeding into your mind that concept that the devil is everywhere, you know. So it deserves to be, I mean, I understand why people put it number 1 on their list. It is great, but there's one film that, to me, is just still my favourite horror movie of all time. And at number 1 is John Carpenter again, with this time In the Mouth of Madness, the final part of his Apocalypse trilogy, which started with the Thing, and had the often maligned middle child of the Prince of Darkness. But In the Mouth of Madness, I mean, there's been many attempts at trying to actually make accurate film depictions of H.P. Lovecraft's work. If you are a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, I would recommend the 2006 film Call of Cthulhu, because it is accurate to the story. It is one of the most accurate film depictions of a Lovecraft story, and it's so cleverly done. It's not what you expect from a film from 2006, but it's actually deliberately made black and white silent film. So it's instead of trying to update the story, they actually made the film like it was actually a 1920s silent movie, and it works so well. But In the Mouth of Madness, without actually being literally based on any H.P. Lovecraft work, is the best Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos film ever. You know, the fact that even the title In the Mouth of Madness is based on At the Mountains of Madness, the fact that the main character brilliantly played by Sam Neill, reads a passage out from one of the books. And the passage he reads as they're approaching the actual Black Church is actually a passage from a Lovecraft story. So Lovecraft's influence is right through the whole thing. You know, there's references to Pickman's model, Hunter in the Dark, At the Mountains of Madness, and so much more. And you know, to me, I love the rock guitar intro, and just everything about the film is the way it builds up on those fears, you know. The way that it actually starts, it's very Lovecraftian, starts in media res, where you've got the main character played by Sam Neill being taken into the Trent's being, you know, reluctantly taken into the institution, which, you know, a mental institution is a very common actually place. Actually, Lovecraft stories actually start or finish, or both, and so it's just everything about it is perfect Lovecraft. Isn't literally based on a Lovecraft thing, but this is John Carpenter's actually foray into Cthulhu mythos, and as Lovecraft, as Carpenter often does, he plays it perfectly, gets the perfect cast, and it's just my favourite horror movie of all time at the moment. Nothing has come close to it. Yes, I mean, Exorcist is one of the greatest films of all time, but I enjoyed In the Mouth of Madness so much more than any other horror film ever. And so there you go, that's my list. What's your number one? Why don't you pop it down in the comments below? Stay till the end of the video. There's a little hint at what comes next on Squirrel Views. But in the meantime, this is Detective Squirrel out.